Yeah, that's scary. So, hello, I'm Erik Runyon, Director of Web Communications at Notre Dame. I know we have a few Notre Dame people over here. Is there anybody else with Notre Dame at all? No? All right. So this presentation is one that I gave a few weeks ago at a higher ed conference. It's called HiEdWeb, 2014.hiedweb.org. So a lot of the content is going to be sort of geared towards that audience and the conference. So we're going to be discussing offline web technologies, why in the past and the future. So first of all, why? Any of you who live in the Southwest Michigan area, you may deal with something like this. My entire extended family, both my family and my wife's, live up in that blue area. And oftentimes, if we go to someone's birthday party or just there for the weekend, we're on one or two bars of Edge network, which is just fantastic when you're trying to catch the updates to a Lions game on your phone and it's taking forever. So if ESPN leveraged some offline web tech, it'd require less to download and things could be a little bit faster. There's always public transportation. There's things like this. I don't know how many of you go to Notre Dame games. Forget about it. You will have no Wi-Fi connection at all or cellular. Or you'll have a full cellular connection, it's just no data will come down.
It's so frustrating.
And also, if you save stuff locally, there's not that round trip to the network, so you'll have a lot of your resources right there, and it'll be a lot faster. And we deal with this audience a lot. People come to us and say, we want an app, when really all they want is something that functions offline. So they don't need like camera access or a lot of other stuff. They just need something that looks app-like, works app-like, but you could do a web app that would do the same, and you wouldn't have to worry about app stores, and then the one or two people that always ruin it by having a Windows phone. So by leveraging web, you can address all of the different devices pretty well without having to worry about all the different IDEs and app stores and stuff like that. So let's talk a little bit about the past. So first of all, obviously we started off with cookies. They were introduced in 1994 by Netscape Communications. It's the day that passed every visit to the browser. My favorite thing about this GIF is right here at the end, the person like reaches over. Oh, we love you, cookie. So, off the top of their head, does anybody know how much data a cookie can store?
240.
Yeah, not a lot. So, if you wanted to do much with storing a lot of data offline, it's really hard to do with cookies. We had a website where we were trying to do all front-side storing of data. This was like 5 years ago, 6 years ago, they built the site. And it's where someone could go through a bunch of events and say, I want to attend this event, this event, this event, this event. And then they could go to a page and get a nice printed output of it. But we were storing all of that in cookies. And it quickly got to a point where people were adding events, and then it just stopped adding events because we're getting the extent of what cookie gets stored. So we had to sort of change how we were storing the data. Some less notable solutions, Flash cookies, Google Gears. I've never used either one. Google Gears was deprecated in favor of some of the technologies we'll be talking about tonight. Which brings us to the future. So the first one we'll talk about is WebSQL database. It's essentially a wrapper around the SQLite library, which gave you essentially a fully transactional database, really nice functionality for those browsers that implemented it. They were all doing the same thing, wrapping it around SQLite, which the W3 org did not like, that everybody was doing the same thing for some reason. But then Firefox and IE never implemented it, had plans to never implement it. And as a result, the spec is no longer in maintenance, so chances are it's not going to get further development. So it's still there in the browsers that have it. So you can still use it if you're focusing on like an iPhone-only web app or something, if you were so inclined. But you can't rely on it to stay there. So next up is IndexedDB. It's sort of the technology that took over for WebSQL. It's not a relational database like WebSQL is, so it's a little less powerful. But it does give you an API to where you can store data and you can search on keys and store quite a bit of data. It's not relational, so you lose some of what WebSQL had, but at least it's supported in all major browsers now. It just landed in iOS 8 a couple months ago when that came out, so that pretty much opened it up. Now, like Rob was talking about, sometimes syntaxes can be a little verbose to try to get things to work correctly. So this is just the matter of setting up a database. So we're giving it a name, we're giving it a version number, and we're essentially setting up our first table here. This create object store is setting up the table itself, and we're saying there's a key called unique ID. And then if it's successful, then we finally have a pointer DB to what we can work with. And then as far as adding something, you have to do all of this typing again and say add. I'm going to talk real fast through this stuff. I've never actually used an IndexedDB in production for anything. I've played around with tutorials and stuff, but I haven't found any reasons to use it in production yet. So I get the basics of it, but I'm by no means an expert in this technology. So accessing data, updating data. So like we already had a title, so now we can give it a new title. If we access it, we set the new title, taking the web offline.
That was some ringtone.
So, kind of like Nightmare, there are wrappers for IndexedDB and WebSQL. So it would essentially, you have a more abstracted language that's easier to work with that will combine the two. So it will essentially do a check and see which of the technologies is available and use the most appropriate. You can say, well, the number of them you can say, if WebSQL is available, default to that if both of them are there, or just use whichever one happens to be available. And by combining the two, you get a lot more coverage as far as browser support goes. So IndexedDB lets you store large sets of data that needs to be searchable. Whoa. So web storage. Web storage is actually a lot easier to work with. It's more of a key value storage, and it has two different iterations, session storage and local storage. They share the same syntax, they just have slightly different functionality. They've been around for quite a while in most browsers. I mean, even ID8 has been around for a while at this point. Session storage is literally just for the current tab and session. So if that tab closes, technically all the data that you're storing is supposed to get wiped out. Think about using something like that if you're doing banking websites or something where you need to be able to store data locally, but you don't want it to persist. And then local storage will stick around for a lot longer, even if you restart the browser. So in the code samples that we're going to be looking at, I'm going to be using local storage for everything. But if you just swap out local storage for session storage, you get the same thing essentially. So real quick, just to look at a demo of this. This is a big card because I can't see it on my screen. So if you come into the local storage, you can add that, add some stuff to session storage. Okay, so we have these two set up. You can refresh the browser, it's all still there. But if we take this same URL, open it up in a new tab and paste it, you can see we only have the local storage. Session storage is gone because it's not supposed to stick around for other tabs. Now, one thing to keep in mind is Chrome is very helpful. So if you close the tab and then you do the Command-Shift-T to pop the tab back open, it will pull the data back in. So something to keep in mind dealing with that. Another thing is web storage and local storage are both URL specific. So here you can see I'm running a local host. But if I come over here and I have my local storage, this is the exact same page, just calling it at a different URL. And if I refresh here, you won't get the data for either one because they're sitting over on the localhost tab instead of the md.dev tab.
Is that just the domain or the subdomain?
It's the domain.
Okay.
So it's not quite the same as cross-origin where subdomains can screw you up.
Right. And so if you come in here and go into resources, local storage, you can see the values there, and you can actually come in here and mess with it and change it and delete it and whatnot if you're debugging. So testing to see if it's available. Vanilla JavaScript is just window.localStorage. Check to see if it's undefined. You can also use Modernizer. This is the syntax for setting and getting. There's 3 different ways of doing each. So you can either do the set item, or you can treat it like it's an array, or like it's a JavaScript object. Either one will work. I pretty much like to stick to the first one. For one, I've seen a number of sites that recommend it. And second, if you compare it to the rest of the syntax, especially when you look at remove item, it shares the similar syntax, so it just makes a little more sense when you're looking through your code. And then you can clear out local storage by calling clear on it. Now, it only stores strings. So if you set an item and pass in like an integer, and then when you get it out, it's going to be a string of 500. And same with arrays. So before you can store an array or a JavaScript object, you need to run it into JSON stringify, and then you parse it when you pull it back out. So storage limits, you get a lot more storage using local storage than you would with cookies, like a whole lot more. And if you're just storing strings, then your chances are that you're not going to exceed that limitation. Like I mentioned, you can go into the resources tab and you can actually edit the text and delete it and mess around with it, and really debug stuff all that way. So this was the website for the conference. I helped build the site, and so the feature that we used local storage for was the conference schedule. It was a 5-track conference, so there were a whole lot of tracks. So we didn't want people to have to go into the schedule and have to like swipe through a whole bunch of presentations that they weren't going through just to see what they were going to. So we gave them the option to be able to edit the schedule. It's just a simple matter of grabbing an ID and storing those IDs in local storage. So essentially we just created a single local storage value with an array of the IDs that they're actually going to be attending. So that way when the page loads, we take a look and see if that variable is there, then we go ahead and just hide everything that they're not attending, and make it really quick and easy. Same with workshops and academies. There were workshops and academies on the Sunday before, which were also listed in the schedule, and they took up space at the top, so we gave people the option to be able to hide those. And if I go back a slide, you can see I'm checking to see if hide academies is true, and it's true in quotes because we can't store Boolean. So it could be anything that you want to, whatever you want to set it to, as long as you're setting and checking the same thing. Some items of note: clearing the browser cache does not clear web storage. So if someone goes in and like does the typical clear, it's not going to touch your web storage data. You pretty much have to either clear it through the script or go into the console and clear it out that way. There's no built-in way to expire it. Like when you create a cookie, you can set an expires date. You can't do that with web local storage. So you would have to essentially, if you want to do something like that, you would have to like set a variable in your local storage to say expire it on this date, and then have your script check that, expire it, and set a new one. Like I mentioned, data scope the domain. So local storage is great for quickly and easily storing small amounts of data, especially string data. So the last thing we're going to cover is AppCache. So application cache essentially provides a manifest file that you can list all of the resources that you want to store on the device for offline storage or offline use. So that way, if you are in airplane mode like this device is and you go to the URL, you're actually going to get the website instead of nothing at all, which is very handy. If any of you have been to conferences where the Wi-Fi continually is just going down, it actually proves very, very handy. Support has been around for quite a while, and it's everything except IE. However, it did get a pretty bad rap a couple of years ago. This article came out in the list report. The article has a lot of great points because AppCache is a very painful technology to work with. Even if you think you understand it as you're working through the site, you're going to find bugs in it that's going to bite you in the ass and kind of have you pulling your hair out at certain times. So getting started with it, first thing you have to do is you have to make sure that the MIME type is served up correctly on your server. So this is Apache and .NET, how to do that. If these are not served, if the file's not served up with the correct MIME type, the browser's just going to ignore it and nothing's going to work. Second of all, you want to make sure that your manifest file does not get cached. Because if it gets cached, then that's all the browser's going to look at. You can make as many updates to your website as you want. Anybody who has that cached version is just going to keep getting the exact same website over and over and over again and never get an update. And there was an actual Firefox bug that was caching the manifest files. So this is just a way to make sure that it doesn't happen to you. To get it set up, all you would need to do is add a reference in your HTML tag to the file. .appcache is the recommended file extension. It doesn't have to use that. You can use whatever you want. And then the actual manifest file, it's essentially, it starts off with cache manifest, and then you start listing off the files that you want stored. But there's quite a bit more to it than that. Some notes on domains. Resources do not have to be on the same domain to be cached. So that's handy if you're using like Google's version of jQuery, for instance. You don't have to store it locally, you can just link out to it, it will still get cached just fine. If you are serving the application itself over HTTPS, then all of the resources that you're linking to have to be on the same origin, except in Chrome. Google, I believe, are treating this correctly, assuming that there's a lot of CDNs in use these days. So requiring everything to be on the same domain is really limiting, so they don't require you to be on the same domain. So for the basic structure, it always has to start with cache manifest as the first line in the file. I add a comment. This is a comment like you would in Apache or anything else starts with a hash. I always add a comment because in order for the browser to pull down new resources, something in the manifest has to change. So by having a comment like this, you don't actually have to change like a file name or anything, or add a new file or remove a file. You can just change the comment, and that will be considered a fresh manifest, and it will pull down changes. The cache header, that only needs to be there if it's not the first thing, the first header after this. So like in this instance, we technically wouldn't have to have that header since it immediately follows the cache manifest. But if we wanted this to appear after any of these other headers, you would have to have it.
You mentioned, sorry.
Go ahead.
You mentioned list of explicit URLs, so you can't just do like CSS/dar or CSS.
No.
You can't.
Nope. Network is the only section that you can actually use a wildcard.
Okay.
Everywhere else you have to specifically list what it is.
So there's no amount of like dynamic. I guess that makes sense because.
Only in this sense. Like here you're saying anything that's in that folder, fall back to that file. So that's one way you can do it, but it limits you. You can't like do a star in a file name and actually have it work. Network, having that wildcard is really handy because there's going to be a lot of files that are going to call other files, especially if you're using things like Google Analytics or Twitter widgets or anything else, because essentially you have a JavaScript thing that you drop in, but then that's calling out additional files. And back when that AppCache is a douchebag article was written, I'm not sure that was around, so it caused a lot of things to fail. So this way, if you have that, anything that's not listed here is just going to say, all right, fine, you have to be online if you want to use that. It just keeps humming along. That's fine. And fallback is for anything that you want to happen if the file doesn't exist. So obviously a dynamic file, you can give it a static fallback, or anything within this images folder, just use this offline ping or whatever. So the order of things is very important to keep in mind when working with this. So first thing that happens is the browser comes to the site and downloads the site like it would normally. And then if it notices there's a manifest file, it will read that and download all of the assets, save it to the device. Next time the visitor returns, the AppCache file is used to serve up everything that was downloaded previously. Even if the user is online, everything gets served from the cache. At that point, then the browser checks to see if the manifest file is updated. And if it is, then it goes out and it grabs all the fresh resources and brings them down. And then on the next visit or refresh, then the user will get the updated cache that it just downloaded. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, because it doesn't seem that intuitive. The referencing file, so like previously when we had the reference to the application cache file, you do not need to list those files in your manifest because those will automatically get cached and downloaded. And in fact, you can't even tell it to network whitelist it. You can't say don't cache this file. There's no way around it. It's going to get cached. And the manifest file must be updated for new files to be downloaded. So you could go through and you could change every single file in your site, and new versions will not get downloaded unless the manifest file is touched in some way. And if any file specified cannot be found, it's considered a bad manifest. It gets tossed out and doesn't get used at all. It'll just function like your online without cache manifest.
It doesn't just ignore the single file that was missing?
Nope.
You douchebag.
That's not fragile. It's not fragile at all.
No. And like I mentioned, cache files are always served from AppCache, even if you're online. It'll just pull down your versions afterwards. So something to keep in mind is with fonts, because typically in a standard font stack, you're looking at least 4 different versions. You've got SVG, WAF, TrueType, OpenType. So if you were still setting it up that way, and you include all 4 of those fonts in your manifest file, then every browser, regardless of which one they're actually going to use, is going to download every single font file, which is not great. Because like Google Fonts, you would pass in this import in your style sheet, and it would pick out the specific one that it wants, and you don't really know which one's going to be unless you want to research it a lot. So what I typically do in sites where I'm going to use this, like I did for the Hyatt website, is I use WAF because it has the largest coverage of any of the file formats. And then just make sure that in your CSS you have a good fallback for browsers that don't use WAF. So that way I'm only referencing a single font file and not going to have to worry about the rest of them. So the JavaScript side of AppCache, there are a number of ways that you can interface with it from JavaScript. You can use things like progress, because it'll tell you how many files there are and what file you're on, so you could actually do like a loading thing if you wanted to for some reason, so people would know how AppCache is downloading, but I can't think of a reason why. The most important one is update ready, because with that you can actually listen for when a new version of the cache is ready. So someone comes to the site, it starts loading the files in the background, and once it's done, you can pop up something to say, hey, there's a new version, would you like to reload and get the new content? Now, technically, you could just listen for that and refresh the browser on the user, but that could be frustrating because sometimes, depending on the number of files, someone could be interacting with the site and doing something, and if you suddenly refresh it on them, it could be frustrating to the user. So I wouldn't recommend doing that.
So if it sees an update, like you change the version, it will actually load the page with the old versions, download the new one. So the page could have different HTML and things like that, and would appear broken for one page load, basically.
It wouldn't be broken, it would just be old content.
Yeah, we just use the old cache.
But if you had any sort of dynamic interactions, then the dynamic interactions would be broken. Like if you had a search button that actually went out and made a call to a server, you change the endpoint for that, for example.
Yeah, something like that.
Because you could theoretically have a broken.
But if you're not,
Although you
if it's
probably have a
functioning
fallback
offline, it's not a
URL for
problem.
those type of things.
Oh,
anyway.
you're
Sure,
downloading
I'm
the
just saying
HTML.
if you did it wrong.
You're downloading the HTML as well? You're not just down, okay.
It forces the HTML because that's the referencing file.
Okay.
It automatically
Like those
caches
better.
it.
Gotcha.
So storage limits. Trying to research and find actual storage limits was really frustrating, and those numbers probably aren't even correct. Because the thing is, if you just, I'm just going to show you Chrome's documentation for how it calculates it. So essentially it takes half of the storage available on the device, and they're using larger numbers than what's probably feasible, especially if you're talking about mobile devices. So it looks at takes half the storage, and then each app that's using it can have up to 20% of that shared pool, or whatever that total is divided by the number of apps. So, and then once the device runs out of space, like if there's no longer space left, then it takes the oldest AppCache, the last one that was accessed, so like the oldest one, it just tosses it out. So luckily it doesn't do like, well, we'll just take part of it, because that can really screw up your app if you have part of your AppCache, not the rest of it. And so that's considered temporary storage. Now things like local storage, accessory storage, that's permanent storage, so that wouldn't be wiped out, but right now AppCache is considered temporary, so it would just toss the whole thing. So really when it comes to storage limits, it just kind of depends. So a quick example is this is the Notre Dame countdown page. It's on the game day site /countdown. And really all it does is it shows the time until the next game and what the results were in previous ones. You can tell I pulled this screenshot before the whole Florida
Yeah, I was
State
gonna say
That's
thank you.
well done.
Thank you, I appreciate that
game.
screenshot.
I was actually at the conference when the Florida State game was on. Yeah, we'll call that a questionable loss. So this site doesn't actually have AppCache on it live. I just took a version of the site and made AppCache local because we're still working on getting AppCache working with our CMS. But this is the manifest file for this entire site because it's pretty simple. You've got CSS, JavaScript, the external jQuery, which caches just fine, and then a list of the images, and then network for anything else like Google Analytics or Gauges or whatever. And so if you look at if you actually have your console open when you load a site that uses AppCache, you can actually watch the progress as things are loaded. So you can see where the site's loaded, and then you can see it downloading in the background. So it makes it pretty easy to keep track of it. Similar to local storage, you can go in and view AppCache in the Resources tab. The difference being is that you cannot edit this. You can't come in here, you can't delete, you can't edit, you can't do anything in this view. You would have to go to Chrome AppCache internals, and that would kick you back a page with a bunch of these entries on it. It's just a very Spartan looking page. If you use Google Apps at all, you'll see a whole bunch of Google Docs stuff in there because they use local storage a lot. A number of them being like 12 to 15 megabytes in size. But at least this lets you go in and you can remove it and you can view it and at least be able to do some debugging. Another example is the Hi-Ed Web website. The reason why we decided to do application cache on this website, one, because conference Wi-Fi sucks. Constantly goes down, especially when you're at a conference with 700 web professionals. Usually conference hotel Wi-Fi doesn't stand a chance. And second, because in the past the conference would have native apps. Sometimes it would just be an iOS app, sometimes there would be an Android app as well, but there would never be a Windows app or BlackBerry for those people. So we decided that since we were building a responsive website and it was going to work well on mobile anyway, why not just give it a shot, do a website that's going to work offline and be able to hit everybody with the same code base. So unlike game day, we had to specify which pages were important that we wanted to make sure were cached and downloaded. So schedule and the keynotes and whatnot. Since I was doing this all by hand, I would often group the images with the pages, so that way if I'm updating something, I can know what I'm dealing with. Sponsor images, there were 28 sponsors, and each of them had their logo on the website. And so initially we had it set up to pull down all of the sponsor logos, but then we started noticing that whenever the cache manifest is refreshing, it's re-downloading all these images, and it was slowing things down a lot. So by day 2, we're like, sorry vendors, but you're not going to get your logo if they're offline because you're not what's important at that time. We just really want people to be able to hit their schedule and be able to see what they needed to go to next. Support staff, so like I mentioned, WAF is the only font that we use, and then the JavaScript and CSS files. And then we had fallbacks for pages with forms, because obviously if you're offline, you can't submit a form anyway. And then pretty much anything that wasn't specified is going to have a fallback to the offline. And so instead of doing a JavaScript pop-up when there was a new content available, we instead checked for when it was ready, then we slid down a little banner to let people know that there was a new version, and then make it reload from there. So it was less obtrusive than popping something up in somebody's face. And interestingly enough, this the conference site did, or the Wi-Fi did go down quite a bit during the conference. And one of the times the conference president was like on the website and was like hitting us up in the back channel saying, why is the Twitter widget and Flickr widget on the homepage broken? We're like, it's not broken, Wi-Fi's down. And they're like, oh great, okay, go on, never mind. So wrapping it up, IndexedDB for searchable data, web storage for quicker and easier bits of storage, AppCache for if you would need to go offline. Now, for the conference website, we turned it on when the conference started, and we turned AppCache off when the conference ended, because we really only cared about that period of time when people are going to be killing the Wi-Fi. Before and after, it really doesn't matter, because then the schedule isn't as important at that point. But I would recommend getting out there and playing with these web technologies, so that way if you know how they work, especially with things like AppCache, you're going to know the gotchas and how things should function. So that way if some project comes along, you're going to have that in your back pocket to be able to say, this will or won't work.
When you remove an app cache, like if you just kill the manifest file, does that register an updated cache?
You literally that flashed out of my head.
What we did is we removed it from the HTML tag, and then we renamed the AppCache file.
Okay.
Because then it no longer, even if the browser came and it would try to go check the new AppCache, it's no longer there at that old file name.
That will register.
Boom, and then it's gone.
That basically, I was wondering if a 404 registers like a new manifest.
Yep.
Okay.
And so that pretty much busts it. And so there's the credits. If you want a copy of these slides, they're up. They're out on Speaker Deck already. Been there for a few weeks. So any of the links or whatever are out there. And actually, that's not my URL anymore, but it'll redirect. So that's it. Any questions on this stuff?
What if we want you to have that beard again?
I grow it back for conferences, actually. Because that's my Twitter avatar. And I've gone to conferences. People are like, oh, I didn't recognize you without the beard, so I just grow it back every time I go to a conference. But it
sounds
has
easier than changing your avatar.
Well, it has a limited shelf
Zero
life.
effort required.
That's true. You just don't shave.
It has a limited shelf life with my wife. She's okay with it for a couple weeks, and then she's like, it's time to get a shave now. All right.
So this is less of a question, but a comment. Local storage, I've had a little experience with it myself, and one of the places I found it really interesting is if anyone's familiar with Ionic framework, or in general any sort of phone gap apps, but Ionic is one that kind of rolls Cordova with Angular, and local storage works in there, so you can actually generate essentially from HTML and JavaScript native apps for multiple platforms. So if you do want, if a website that does all this isn't appropriate for your use, there is a way to get local storage, using local storage to get that kind of functionality in a native app while still writing it in web-based technologies.
Okay. Oh, and one other thing about AppCache, I'm assuming it's possible, and I'm going to work on this later, but there should be easy enough ways to work with a CMS to have it automatically generate your AppCache file for you. So that way, if someone updates a page, it will update the comment or whatever and bust things out. But I wouldn't recommend using it on standard websites anyway, unless you have a very specific reason, which is why we turned it off in the conferencing. Oh, and full disclosure, those intermittent slides was blatantly stolen from John Newmaker as an idea. So, so that's something he used in presentations. I like the idea.
People get bored every 10 minutes, so you gotta hit them with something good.
I tried really hard to find a photo of me in the boy band.
It's better without photos.
It is
It actually fits
The
your
imagination runs wild.
Yeah. I have pictures.
I'm sure I have a VHS tape somewhere. An actual performance.
It actually fits the presentation well because you're talking about things being offline.
Yeah.
There you go.
So what happens if So when you first go, or the second time you go to it, even if you are online, it loads up the AppCache.
Yes.
So what would it do with the sponsor images? Would it?
Well,
first
at that
load
point,
the-
you're back online, so it would show them.
Okay.
Because we
So
have
it
them
would
in the
load that.
offline section, so, or the fallback. So yeah, so once someone's online, it would definitely show the images because they're online, but it would still be showing any cached HTML if they happen to be there. All right, we're out by 8. Thank you.